You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you on another Monday. It's Big 12 Media Eve. Do you care? I don't know. It just means we're going to talk football here soon in the coming days. We get an opportunity to kind of talk to, well, not kind of. We get an opportunity to talk to a bunch of people in the Big 12. Hear from Commissioner Brett Yormark, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's the day before. If you're listening to this, I will be traveling today to Dallas, where we will be doing Big 12 Media Days for the next 2 days. And we'll get into that here shortly. But just a little preview of what's on today's episode. So we're going to recap a few things that happened last week, like Ring of Honor inductees and latest football commits. And then we'll do a preview of Big 12 Media Days, kind of the storylines, different things that way, as well as we'll do a little preseason poll, my preseason poll. So we'll get into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, so last week, early in the week, the University of Utah announced its latest Utah Football Ring of Honor inductees. So if you remember, last year was the first year that Utah opened up the Ring of Honor, and they just went with one. They went with Alex Smith, a deserving individual who obviously means a lot to the university in a lot of ways, and so they decided to use just one individual to kind of open it up, and that was Alex Smith. And then moving forward, they wanted to do two individuals every single year. So this year, we get former head coach Ron McBride and then former wide receiver who is in the 1960s, Roy Jefferson. Two individuals that have had a lot of impact on the University of Utah, none more than Ron McBride, right? Obviously, Utah has taken it to the next level, whether it be Urban Meyer or obviously with Kyle Whittingham, but Ron McBride basically turned Utah into what it is today. You can credit a lot of what Utah is based on what he was able to do. Before that, if I'm remembering correctly, and I didn't take my notes like I was supposed to, the University of Utah had only been to 2 bowl games in its entire history. Ron McBride shows up and ends up going on, I believe it was 9 bowl games. Just completely changes the tone of the program, gets Utah into a position where they're one of the best teams in the WAC, and then later into the Mountain West Conference. Obviously was just a phenomenal head coach that means a lot to the community, means a lot to the program. He's obviously stayed very close to the University of Utah and, had stints with Weber State, and he's done stuff with other various colleges and high schools. He loves the game of football and he wants to be embedded in that culture. But a lot of people, when you look at the history of Utah, are going to look at Ron McBride as being, we'll call it the godfather, right? In what he was able to do. And so the fact that they're honoring him makes perfect sense. There's not many more deserving people than Ron McBride. The only more successful coach at Utah is Kyle Whittingham, who will undoubtedly be in the Ring of Honor, whenever his time comes. That could be sooner than later. We're not entirely sure, but he absolutely took what Ron McBride did and took it to another level. So really, really deserving honor for him. And then Roy Jefferson, look, I'm not going to BS you and pretend like I know everything about Roy Jefferson, but I do know that, in the 1960s, he was a dominant athlete for the University of Utah. He became one of the top receivers in Utah history. He still holds records that are inside the top 10. Those have been broken since, but he is still in the top 10. Went on to have a promising NFL career where he was able to lead the league in receiving yards one year. If I remember right, it was with 3 different teams that he played. Just a really dynamite athlete who did a lot for the University of Utah in bringing them the success that they needed to be able to get to where then, a coach like Ron McBride could transition and make the university even better. So two deserving individuals that will be honored at the Cal Poly game. This will be the home opener for Utah, so week 2. So get there, honor these guys, right? Like, this is a deserving thing. Ron McBride especially, he's been in the Utah Hall of Fame. He's been in the College Football Hall of Fame. I mean, these are all deserving individuals. So that took place last week, at least the announcement of it, and we'll get to actually see them be inducted into the Ring of Honor to become number 2 and 3 all-time in that Cal Poly game. So look forward to that. And then last week, there was also a few commits to Utah. As you remember, I've kind of gone over these each week to kind of say where Utah's at, who is signed, that kind of stuff. Utah is now currently at 17 commits based on the 3 players that committed last week. So you do get the Pula twins. You get Jaron and Keenan Pula, 4-star wide receiver and a 3-star wide receiver, high 3-star wide receiver for Keenan. These two are absolute game changers for the University of Utah. Not only are they quote-unquote hometown heroes, a lot of people like to use that phrase. It is what it is. They're staying home. They are game changers for Utah, especially in the skills positions. You get Jaron, who is a bona fide wide receiver who has a ton of skill that will give Utah a lot of opportunity. Depending on, how Devin Dampier does this year. Does he stay? Is he going to the NFL? It's really unknown what it is. Regardless, whoever is at quarterback under center next year, Jaron is 100% a guy that can be an impact player from day one. So look forward to him. And then Keenan, 3-star wide receiver, like I said, high. This is more of an athlete player. He's one that can play both sides of the ball. He is being recruited as a wide receiver, but there's a huge emphasis on his ability to be able to be a safety. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if Utah transitions him to safety. I know the old style of having players that are on offense move to defense. That's come down, as one of those things that Kyle Whittingham does. But over the years, it hasn't always been that way. So pulling an offensive player to defense, it's still a thing that Utah likes to do, but at the same time, should be a pretty good opportunity for Utah to have a really skilled player in that safety position. You could use him on both sides of the ball. But for the most part, you just overall have a talented athlete that's gonna do well. So big win for Utah. As I've mentioned before, these two were committed to UCLA before a last-minute switch. They took an official visit on June 20th, and then everything seemed open to them coming to and committing to Utah. So you've got that, and then over the weekend you get Moses Sparks. He's a 3-star offensive lineman. Actually the number 1 recruit from New Mexico. So Utah has done well in kind of their rankings. They have the number 1 recruit from Idaho, number 1 recruit from New Mexico, number 3 recruit from Idaho, number 2 recruit from Oregon. Look, not all of these are hotbeds, right? Like, I get it, but these are still pretty dynamic athletes who, you're winning inside of these states. And I think that's important for Utah. There's always something that you can complain about with recruiting. There's always something you can worry about. But Utah is doing well as of late to be able to get the players that they want. And that's been a win. If you remember right, about a month and a half ago, there was a lot of worry about, worry meaning early, frustrations, I guess you could say, that this was not going to be a big or talented recruiting class for Utah simply because they had 1 player committed. But Utah has done a ton of work in the month of June to really put themselves in a good position. Like I said, they now have 17 commits. So they got 16 commits from that time where the end of May to now. And, things have been trending very high for Utah. Obviously, they're not hitting on every single player that they'd like, but they also feel like they've gotten better in a lot of the positions that they want. So, Kelvin Obot, for example, is a big reason for that. Number 1 offensive tackle, he's the number 1 player from Idaho. He's a 4-star offensive tackle from that. And if you believe On3, he's the 9th rated best offensive tackle. So a lot of talent coming in. And then Utah's still waiting for one more that they're really high on. They believe that they have a good chance at him, and that's Celesi Moa. Obviously, this is the son of Ben Moa, former Utah player. This is the 4-star athlete that I've been talking about, number 1 recruit in the state of Utah. You pick him up, and that means a ton for the University of Utah, and you'd have to like the chances of what Utah can do to kind of clean up this class. Just looking at it right now, Utah ranks 46th in the country, according to 24/7 Sports, based on the recruits that they have. If you were to sign Moa, you jump up to number 30 in the country. You're 8th in the Big 12 right now. If you got Moa, you get up to number 3 in the Big 12. So, great opportunity to be able to land somebody that not only can be an impact player as a dual threat, two-way player, that can mean a lot for the program, but you also get an opportunity to be able to improve your recruiting rankings, which, Utah's not as concerned about that as others may be, but it definitely helps. And, if they're able to get some flips later on, if their season goes well, that kind of stuff, that only bodes well for Utah. So that's where Utah stands with recruits right now. And outside of Moa, there are a few that are potentials, but I think you're going to see more of a focus on moving forward to the next class, right? You're going to see them still stay committed to this 2026 class, but now any recruiting efforts are going to be being pushed to 2027 and moving forward as they've gotten the bulk of their class together. We still don't know the official signing days this year. That's still up for the debate. There's been a push to move this until January to be able to have one signing period, one transfer period. Most likely it'll still stay the same as December as an early period, and then stick with that February 1 as the actual signing day, which most people don't utilize as much, but we'll see what happens. So you've got that good spot for Utah. They've cleaned up really well. Obviously, you can improve, you can do better, but based on the past 2 seasons that Utah's had, you have to be pretty happy with that recruiting class, knowing that you bottomed out in a lot of ways last year, and you were still able to do well. Like I said, if you can get Moa, you're a top 30 in the country, which is on par with where they've been roughly for the last few years. There was one year where they weren't as high simply because they only took like 10 or 12 recruits based on 247 Sports. That kind of changes things. But, good spot for Utah. So with that said, let's jump into Big 12 Media Day preview. Now, Media Day, it's essentially talking, right? There's a lot of talking. There's still not football being played. Every program going into this feels like they've improved. Every program feels like they're doubted. Nobody believes in them. All those cliche statements that you're going to hear, right? But it's still an important time of the year in the sense that you get to understand where these programs are at currently, right? That doesn't mean that this is going to foretell, how the season is going to go for any of these programs. But at the very least, you kind of get the basic storylines. You understand what's going on with each program. You can kind of see where your team fits in with others. For example, Texas Tech feels really good about themselves simply because they've been spending the most money. They've gotten a ton of transfers. They're doing well in the recruiting trail. There was a big hang up there. I was trying to talk about Felix Ojo there. This is obviously the guy that Utah brought in as a 5-star offensive tackle, and last minute decided to sign with Texas Tech for a reported $5 million. This is what Texas Tech is up to. So you're going to have programs like that feel really good about themselves going into the season, and the real question will come down to whether they can actually live up to that hype. But every program is going to be there, right? If you remember last year, and I know you do, and I know you don't want to talk about it, Utah was picked to win the conference. Obviously, that didn't even come close. Utah really just did not live up to their expectations, and there was a lot of factors that went into that. But then you have programs like Arizona State and BYU who are at the bottom of the rankings and ended up coming out at the top, right? You're going to have a lot of that where some teams are doubted, some teams are disrespected. Honestly, Arizona State, you could see that there was going to be, a better improvement, and picking them last was kind of crazy. But at the same time, you still had a new coach. You still had new turnover on the roster. You had a quarterback that, was expected to be good, but, you didn't know what it was going to be. And so there's reasons why a team like that was picked last, but they definitely felt disrespected. BYU felt disrespected and kind of created this mentality of, us against them, and it works, right? These types of things work for teams. Doesn't always work, but at the same time, when you have success early, it's easy to kind of keep that mantra going and move forward. So some of these things are important from Media Day, where you're going to hear kind of the tone and tenor of what these programs are saying, how they're looking at things. Like I said, you're not going to get anybody that's going to come up there and say, man, we really did not improve in this area. You might get some nuance there, and you might find out that they're, a little weak in some areas, but for the most part, every coach, every player is going to be like, I like our team, I like our chances, we're going to the playoff. And so you kind of got to filter through that, and we'll get through some of that next week as I recap Big 12 Media Days. So we will hear from Brett Yormark, this conference commissioner. There's been a lot going on over the summer, so I'm expecting to hear a lot of different things, for example, like the House settlement. You're going to get the House settlement and kind of what that means for the Big 12. That would include NIL, and under the new partner of NIL Go, which is essentially Deloitte checking in on a lot of these NIL deals, how they go, what is it going to mean, that kind of stuff. You'll also have conversations about the Big 12's new PayPal partnership, and being able to kind of have that aspect and being able to help the athletes and get some money there. You'll have conversations about the College Sports Commission. If all of these things are unknown to you, go back a few episodes where I talk about all these things, and you'll kind of get a little bit more of an insight. You'll also have conversations about the college football playoff expansion. Yes, we've expanded, last year to 12 teams, but there's a growing sentiment that you're not going to stay at 12. You're going to be at 14 at minimum. You're going to go to 16. And the best model that has come about for some of these conferences outside of the Big Ten is the 5+11 model. Once again, I go through a lot of these in previous episodes. You can go back and listen to those. But essentially, 5 auto bids from the top 5 conferences, and then 11 at-large bids just to get you to 16 teams, right? So, there's going to be conversations there and what the Big 12 wants. Some of that's already been known. You'll have conversations about the transfer portal, a January window, trying to get these players set into their programs. You're not trying to do this in the middle of bowl season, that kind of stuff. I'm sure he'll talk about parity in the Big 12 again, the fact that Vegas odds have, 7-ish, 8 teams basically predicted all to have a chance. Kind of shows the parity. And I'd argue it has even more parity this year than last year. But we'll see. That could be a stupid statement by the end of the year, and we're like, okay, this is stupid. But and then there's going to be conversations around private equity. The Big 12 had conversations about that last year. That was a big thing about how the Big 12 was open to private equity, and everybody kind of had the doom and gloom and were worried. And then they decided, no, it's not a good time for them to do that. There's still going to be interest, but there wasn't an interest in being able to move forward for obvious reasons. And then I'm sure you're going to hear stuff like a deeper partnership with Microsoft and what they're doing to help the players and yada, 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 yada. Okay. I know you don't care about the Brett Yormark comments for the most part, but they're going to have an impact on kind of the tone this conference is trying to set amongst the rest of the conferences, right? The Big Ten and the SEC are seen as the top dogs of college football for good reason, right? They have some of the best teams in both conferences. That's where everybody would love to be able to end up. That's where everybody kind of expects it to break with 2 conferences and then everybody else after that. So they're going to get a majority of the attention. The Big 12 and the ACC, respectively, they're going to have a lot of comments in relation to that, right? You're going to have, shots fired at these conferences, maybe. And trying to position themselves in a way where the Big 12 feels like they still have a voice. And these type of addresses in the middle of summer, right before football is played, go a long way in how you're going to see that. That doesn't always work that way. You may remember the Pac-12 had these shots fired moments, and that blew up in their face. And the Pac-12 is a completely different conference now, right? It's a beefed up Mountain West Conference. I'm sorry to anybody that disagrees with me, but that's essentially what it is, right? You do have Washington State and Oregon State as the holdovers from the old Pac-12, but that's just what it is. So you're going to hear a lot of these different things being said to kind of position that. And I'd pay attention to kind of the direction there. Some of these comments, as anything with the football and stuff like that, are meaningless. But at the same time, it's more of a direction on how this conference wants to go. And Brett Yormark has been very vocal in how he wants this conference to go. And he's been active in the conversations. He doesn't sit there and let somebody come to him. He's been much more direct and trying to make sure that the Big 12 is in a good position. And for any team in the Big 12, whether that's BYU or Utah or any of the other teams there, that bodes well, right? That bodes well to have an active conference commissioner who understands the lay of the land and wants to be a part of it. Will it always work? No. But as you saw, a passive commissioner or one that's just going to use his voice without really backing it up, you see that in the Pac-12, and it didn't work out so well. Times two. You had two commissioners that did that. So really interested to see, this isn't me, as my kids would say, glazing Brett Yormark, but this is just where it is, right? In this day and age, you have to have a conference commissioner who is working hard to be able to make sure that the commission or the conference is in a good position. All right, looking beyond that, nobody cares about that. For Utah, they have obviously Kyle Whittingham showing up, and then they decided to bring 4 players. Some schools win as little as 3. Some schools win as large as 6. That's it's up to each school. You may remember in the Pac-12 era, Utah could only bring 2 players. And so the fact that you're doubling that, I think, is okay for Kyle Whittingham. I don't know that he wants to get even more. But you do get, the stars of the team, so to speak. You get Devin Dampier. There's going to be a lot of conversations about him. We'll talk about some of those in a bit. Spencer Fano, similarly. Obviously this is the focal point on the offensive line, the guy that has the most NFL draft stock as of right now, considered a top 10 pick next year. And so he's going to be there. Has been a great leader, has really transitioned into that, and, will be a great conversation to be able to talk to him and kind of his relationship with Devin Dampier and all that. And then on the defensive side, you have 2 leaders that absolutely mean a ton to this program, and that's Smith Snowden. You may remember that there was a big pull to get him into the transfer portal and try to make sure that he doesn't stay on Utah anymore. The fact that Utah could keep him means a ton, and they're going to lean into him, right? They want him on the field as much as possible. They see him as a star, as a guy that can potentially be an NFL draft pick next year. He's still an underclassman, so he still has time, but there's a real momentum to try to get him to that level where he can be the next defensive back that kind of represents Utah in the NFL draft. So, well-spoken kid, does really well to kind of symbolize the University of Utah and who they are, represents them well. And so you're going to get some good conversations with him. And then you get Lander Barton. Obviously, we've had conversations about him last year. He was still overcoming his injury, getting back into full form. You saw him really kind of get into that at the end of the season, but he was frustrated. He was frustrated that he couldn't do what he wanted to do. There's a lot of fans that were frustrated in kind of what he was not able to do based on kind of the hype and the projections around him. But I think you're going to see a completely different player this year. He's not the most vocal person in terms of media, which is going to be an interesting situation there. But at the same time, he 100% is a vocal leader on the field. And I really think you're going to see a step up in his game this year. You're going to see the player that many expected him to be now that he's 100%. Will it be, a guarantee? No. There's no guarantees in football, especially with injuries or whatever that may be. But I think you're going to see a guy that's hungry and he's ready to go and really has, the understanding of this defense down and will be considered one of the guys that, is going to be the leader of that defense. So I think Utah has good representation. You're going to get some good conversations about kind of what this team can be, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Devin Dampier is the leader of all, right? Like he's the guy that everybody's turning to be kind of the face of the program, and for good reason, but he's living up to it in a way that isn't flashy or trying to bring attention to himself. He's really kind of down to earth and just doing it. I don't want to say doing it the right way. I don't like that kind of statement necessarily, but I think he's doing it in a way that represents Utah well. And so, really curious to kind of see the conversations that are had surrounding him and kind of how people approach him and kind of what goes on there. Now, just for local interest, your rival BYU, they're going to bring LJ Martin, a dynamic running back who, is expected to take a step up even this year and, will be a good representation for BYU. You do also have Chase Roberts, also another dynamic wide receiver who is, arguably one of the best in the Big 12, a guy that is going to represent BYU well, is going to be able to talk about the offense. There's going to be conversations about Jake Retzlaff, and these two are going to have to filter that a lot. They're going to get a lot of media training on how to handle that. But I think you've got two guys that are going to represent that well. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you have Jack Kelly, Isaiah Glasker, and Keanu Tanavasa. That one's not going to be a controversial one for Utah at all. But you do have Jack Kelly and Isaiah Glasker, two linebackers that are going to be the focal point of that defense. Despite any of the changes or turnover that Utah or BYU has on the defensive side of the ball, those two are going to be the continual force, and for good reason. They're both talented. They're going to represent the university well there and explain kind of what's going on there. And then you get to Keanu Tanavasa, who is not short on trying to bring in the hype. I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be conversations about Utah. Wouldn't be surprised about him believing that BYU does it the right way, that BYU is going to dominate this year. That's just kind of the player that he is. So we'll see what kind of happens there. But quite honestly, I don't expect to be a ton of fireworks between these two programs at Media Day, but I could be wrong, right? If there were going to be fireworks, I would have to imagine it comes from Tanavasa. I'm not saying that he stokes that fire, but at the same time, if there's something said, I wouldn't be surprised if it's that. You'll probably get some sort of rivalry smack in good fun. You had Cam Rising last year taking jabs at BYU on BYU TV. So, it's fun little things like that. But I think it could be a fun opportunity. Some other players to watch. This, just kind of short of this, the Big 12 this year, maybe not quite the talent level as the last year of the Pac-12 and when they would call it the year of the QB, when you had Caleb Williams, Bo Nix, Michael Penix Jr., Cam Ward, DJ Uiagalelei was expected to be in there. Even Cam Rising was supposed to be in there. That was expected to be, quote unquote, the year of the QB. And you did essentially with Williams, Nix, and Penix Jr., and Cam Ward. Cam Ward didn't deliver as much as he did in Miami, but you still had, obviously, the number one pick in the NFL draft. So really dynamic players. I see similarities in this year where the attention is going to be on the quarterback. And I think you're going to get a lot of conversations about how deep this conference is with its quarterbacks. Varying levels. I think as it stands right now, Sam Leavitt and Sawyer Robertson are probably the stars of the class. Other players have been involved in that, and they're going to be there. But I think based on what ASU was able to do and kind of the player that Sam Leavitt is, I think you're going to see a lot of attention around him. Sawyer Robertson, really kind of beat out everybody finally. Baylor finally had a quarterback that they felt confident in. He did well. They go off and win 6 straight games at the end of the year. I think you're going to see those two as kind of the cream of the crop in terms of preseason expectations at quarterback. But you've got other players that are going to be mentioned in there and have been mentioned in Jalen Daniels at Kansas, Avery Johnson at Kansas State, so the two Kansas schools. Both of these players have had high expectations heaped upon them. Jalen Daniels more so because of kind of performance on the field, not as high recruiting ratings necessarily, but then Avery Johnson, the bowl game that he had, if I remember right, it was the Pop-Tart Bowl, just changed everybody's expectations for the type of player that he can be. And I don't know that he fully lived up to that last year, but at the same time, you've got two players that have a lot of potential, are going to have a lot of expectations placed on them again as, veteran-ish players, Jalen more than Avery, but you're going to have guys that are expected to take the next step. in kind of their progression. And you're going to hear from them and kind of what they're focusing in on. Outside of that, you've got good quarterbacks that have dominated in the league, like Josh Hoover. The dude threw for 4,000 yards. There's no problems with him being able to get the ball out of his hands. Really dynamic quarterback, but doesn't get a ton of love just simply because TCU wasn't able to stop anybody, right? Like, they allowed a lot of yards, and so for whatever reason, Hoover isn't getting the same publicity that maybe those 4 other quarterbacks are. But we'll see. We'll see what happens there. You also have Brendan Sorsby at Cincinnati. Could be a game changer there. Brocco Becht, obviously a consistent quarterback that does what they need him to do. They win a lot of games. Veteran player who understands the game inside and out, and so you're going to see that. And then beyond that, you've got, Baron Morton at Texas Tech. He obviously has a billion people that he can throw to with talent. And then Devin Dampier is kind of the wild card there. You could throw in Caden Salter or Julian Lewis at Colorado, 2 quarterbacks that will actually be at Media Day. They're the only school that's bringing 2 QBs because their position is still unknown. Those are kind of the wild cards, right? I think Utah fans understand who Devin Dampier can be, and if he can live up to those expectations, then 100% he's probably in that conversation with a Sam Leavitt or Sawyer Robertson if he lives up to those expectations. But I think, you're going to have a fun showing of quarterbacks this year. It's not just 1 or 2. You're going to have a bunch of that. So those are kind of some of the names. There's other players there that, like Jordan Tyson at ASU, that he's going to be there and have a bunch of those. But I think, like I said, this year it's going to be surrounded about the QBs. There's going to be a lot of conversations about that, and so, expect that. Just as kind of a primer for that, I know this is boring. I'm sorry. This is how it is. But I just want to kind of give you the insight of what this is going to be. Day 1, they break these 2 days up into, they split the league. I really said that a weird way. They split the teams in 2 days. There we go. Day 1, you're going to hear from Arizona State, Baylor, BYU, UCF, Cincinnati, Iowa State, Kansas State, and Texas Tech. So you hear from all those coaches and the players. We'll get some sound from them and play, maybe some of the highlights and that kind of stuff. And then day 2 is where, most fans that listen to this podcast are going to pay attention. And that's Arizona, Colorado, Houston, Kansas, Oklahoma State, TCU, Utah, and West Virginia. So Utah will take up the primary time there for me, obviously covering the team. And so we'll get kind of what Utah wants to talk about. And, we'll see what happens there. To me, some of the biggest storylines from Utah, and it feels kind of generic this year. I don't know that there's some huge overarching theme outside of, Devin Dampier and Utah's offense. That's going to be the biggest conversation around this team. Defense is going to be the consistent, tried and true system that Utah's always had. So I don't think you're going to get a ton of conversations about that. But there's going to be a ton of conversations surrounding Devin Dampier and Utah's offense, and for good reason. We've talked about it numerous times on here, so it's not unusual for Utah fans to hear that Utah's offense was trash last year. It didn't do well. There wasn't anything that went well. That's not all on one player. That's not all on, coaches necessarily. It's just nothing worked. And it was just a combination of everything, and that's why Utah went away from it all, right? You do have some consistency with Jim Harding at the offensive line, Freddie Whittingham at tight end, but for the most part, you changed the entire offensive system. You go from wide receivers where you retooled the entire room. The running back room is completely retooled. You have quarterback room obviously retooled outside of, Isaac Wilson, but you essentially rebuilt everything. And so you're going to have a lot of conversations. Any conversations about this Utah team is going to be about that offense. And if Utah succeeds this year, then there's maybe a page to take out of that for future stuff, right? You can say, okay, look, it was a one-year thing. It was all based on Cam Rising and kind of the frustrations and struggles the team had for essentially 2 years of not having Cam. And now it was just kind of, you can move on. I think, if anything, that's the biggest thing is there's not this cloud hanging over Utah going into this media day in terms of will Cam play or not. As you'll remember, for 2 straight years, it was, whether is Cam going to be ready by the season? That's where he'll be ready by UCLA type conversations came about. Maybe we were talking about this year's UCLA, I kid, but there was a lot of conversations about that. And, we're at media days at the last Pac-12 media day, and we're looking at, okay, how's he walking? He's playing pickleball. Does that mean that he's okay? There's a lot of conversations about that, and it takes up a lot of the energy and the kind of the conversations around the team where it was focused on one player. And then the next year, you do have Cam, and everybody's excited, and everybody's coming in, and you've got your star back, and everybody feels confident. And then suddenly, that changes. And once again, you have Cam Rising that takes the spotlight for good reason. And I'm not saying that was a bad thing, but I think you now have a situation where Cam Rising's not back. He's retired from the game. Unfortunately, it didn't end the way that he wanted to, or that Utah wanted him to end. But now you don't have that cloud hanging over it. You've got a team that can focus on themselves, right? And Devin Dampier is going to soak up a lot of that conversation and kind of what it's going to be. But I think that's good for Utah. It shows that they've made progress. There's going to be conversations that are going to be different. That's not to say that things couldn't end the same this year. Somebody out there is probably knocking on wood right now with that. But this is a good opportunity for Utah to have the conversation change. And I think it helps them not have so much of a distraction on one player. Yeah, Devin is going to take up a majority of that, or Spencer may take up some of that, but you're going to have a focus on the team, right? And I think that's what matters for this Utah team. They have come together as one unit, and they're working together. It's not, this person is raised up above somebody else. It's just this whole team is working together. You saw a lot of that in spring, where they're hungry, they're getting after it, and they want to improve in every facet of the game. I don't know that you saw some of that the past 2 years. There was some of it, right? But there's more of a hunger based on not being able to be successful last year, having a lot of change, having kind of the vibe around the team change, whether that be with the coaching staff, with Jason Beck or Mark Artuaya or any of them. There's just been a complete change. And I think, if kids want to say about vibes nowadays, but I think there's reality to that. And you can say vibes or momentum, whatever you want to classify that as. I think that is the important thing. And if this team comes in with confidence, but not really thinking that they've earned it already, and I think there was some of that last year for this Utah team, where they felt like, we've played in the Pac-12, transitioning to the Big 12 isn't going to be anything. Yeah, a lot of that was more on the fans in terms of a lot of conversations about how Utah's going to roll through the Big 12, but I still think some of that was persistent on the team. You had a team that felt like, with Cam Rising, everything can move forward. Utah's going to dominate. And, I really would be fascinated to see what that team would have been like had he been healthy. But I think you kind of lose your edge. And that's why it's tough for some of these teams, when you get to be on top, to maintain that, because you stop doing the things that got you to where you got, right? You take things off a little bit. That's not to say that these guys aren't working hard or continuing to improve their craft and all that kind of stuff, but you lose the edge that you had when you were the underdog, when you were the ones that everybody was doubting. This year, Utah's the one that people are doubting to some extent, right? Like, look, they're going to be a lot of teams, or a lot of places are going to say this is a top 5, top 7 team. I don't know that that's doubting you, but I think you're going to have a lot of opportunities at your disposal, because you have to be hungry. You have to say, last year was far from anywhere where we want to be. We've got to be better. And even though a majority of the players on the offensive side of the ball weren't even on the roster last year, that still gives them that hunger. You buy into that mantra that we weren't good enough last year, and you feel that, right? And I'm curious to see their conversations about that moving forward. Outside of that, you'll probably have more conversations on Kyle Whittingham's tenure. Last year, that was a big storyline, mostly because it was the expectation that Utah would go win the conference, he would retire, win another conference title, that kind of stuff. Obviously, things didn't go that way, as we just mentioned. But I think you're going to still hear some of those conversations, especially with the reworked Morgan Scalley contracts. You're going to have different things that way that you're going to have people ask. You're going to have him, have to kind of give his conversations. And I don't think you're going to get much of a difference in what he's said in the past, that, he'll continue to do it as long as he's having fun, that kind of stuff. This is not a guy that's going to come out there, at least I don't think he is, based on, the long years that I've covered him. He's not going to go out there and make this the farewell tour. But, there's a chance. So, like I said, there's not a ton of big storylines coming from Utah, at least from my side. It's more on the offensive side of the ball and kind of what Utah can be. If they can figure that out, then I think the conversation changes and you're going to see a lot more belief in Utah, but we're going to see. Outside of Utah, some of the storylines that you're going to hear: can Arizona State repeat? Obviously, they bring back a lot of talent. They're the reigning champs. Can they do it without Cam Scadaboo? That kind of stuff. Texas Tech money grab. Will it work? They obviously went heavy in the transfer portal. Reported $10 million were dumped into the transfer portal. It's probably more, maybe less. I don't know. A lot of money. And, will all that oil money essentially win a championship? Will it get them to be competitive? How will that move? So there's going to be a lot of conversations about that. Baylor, are they real? Yeah, you go on a 6-game win streak at the end of the season, but is this a Baylor team that is actually legit? They bring back a ton of players as well, and so there's going to be a lot of love surrounding Baylor. Who's the sleeper team this year? Are we going to have another Arizona State? Are we going to have another BYU? Is that team in Oklahoma State? Is it West Virginia? Who is that team, if there is one? I tend to think that there probably won't be one the same way as last year, but, things could be different. Can Coach Prime be successful without his son and a Heisman winner? Obviously had Shadir Sanders and Travis Hunter. Those two from his time, at Jacksonville State, that, they were his stars. And so can how does his coaching legacy move forward past that, right? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of Jake Retzlaff fallout. There's going to be a lot of conversations about that. You're going to get, no conversations around it, essentially, but there's going to be conversations about it in terms of people asking. Avery Johnson and Jalen Daniels, like I said, are they going to take the next step? Is Mike Gundy cooked? Is he past his time? Obviously, it was not a great season for them. As bad as Utah's was, his was even worse. There was conversations in the offseason about potentially firing him, potentially, forcing him out, reworking his contract, that kind of stuff. This is a make-or-break year for Mike Gundy, which sounds crazy given the success that he's had at Oklahoma State. But I think when they bottomed out, they bottomed out. And there was not a lot of hope and optimism. There's not a lot of hope and optimism about this team again. And so, they're going to be looking for their first win in conference play over the last 2 years. Not a great situation for Oklahoma State. So I don't think they're going to take a ton of the oxygen from the conversation at Big 12 Media Day, but I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that. So you got that. And then you've got retreads at coaching staffs. So you've got Scott Frost returning to UCF, which is probably where he should have just stayed from the beginning. Obviously, they won their quote-unquote national championship there with UCF. But, what will it be like in year one for him in his return? And then you obviously get Rich Rod back at West Virginia, who, if anything, is a character in all of his own, and will be fascinating to watch. So really, really interesting questions coming from Big 12 Media Day. Whether you care about any of those or not remains to be seen. But I think if you're listening to the podcast in the middle of July, maybe you're a little bit more of a fan of college football than others. And so I think you may care. So we'll get into some of those things. I'm not going to go through everything next week, but I want to make sure that we touch on some highlights, kind of point out some stuff and get there. Maybe if, we need to, we'll do a podcast at the end of the week so it's a little bit more fresh, but we'll see. So lastly, before we end the podcast today, I want to jump into kind of a preseason poll. And some context here, the Big 12 this year decided to go away from a preseason poll. I think they saw, what happened last year with Arizona State, and people just don't want egg on their face, right? Especially to that level. Picking a team to finish 16th and then go win the conference just kind of looks weird. At the end of the day, this is preseason projections, right? Like, it's not going to do anything. Yes, it does keep kind of the conversation going in the season. It's real easy for media members like me to be like, the team that was picked 16th, finishes first, those kinds of things. But at the same time, it means nothing, And we get that. I know people get really frustrated by polls, preseason polls, and I get that. But at the end of the day, it's just a way to kind of see the vibe around your team, kind of the expectations about your team, and that kind of stuff. So regardless of the Big 12 doing it or not, I created my own poll. I don't know how good I feel about it. I think we're looking at it based on preseason expectations. We're seeing it based on that. And everything is absolutely going to change, right? I don't think there's a poll in July that has ever defined a conference or anything. And so it's more just kind of a snapshot into how teams are going into the season, right? So take it for what it is. I created my own poll, and I did that all before, and I actually created 5 tiers that I did, but I was curious, right? I like to use AI just as kind of a, the chat GTPs, the Geminis, or whatever you want to call them, just to kind of see what others are doing and kind of see things. I will say I do not use it for my own reporting in terms of using it as a reporting mechanism. I don't just say, hey, create a top 20 or top poll for the Big 12. I just like to see kind of how it does because it pulls from different resources and stuff like that. So I'm going to give you the AI response poll. They tiered it into 4. I have 5. Like I said, I created mine before I did this, so I wasn't influenced by it. I haven't changed anything. That's not to say that I feel good about my poll, but at the same time, just kind of giving that context. So as the AI response goes, their conference title contenders is how they've labeled it, is 4 teams: Baylor, Kansas State, Arizona State, and Texas Tech. So those are your top 4 teams. I don't necessarily disagree with that to an extent, and I'll get into mine shortly. Strong bowl teams with upside. That's how they classify this one. Another 4 teams: Utah, Iowa State, TCU, and BYU in that order. And then the next tier is middle of the pack / bowl eligible push. That is Kansas, Cincinnati, Houston, and Colorado. And then lastly, the last 4 teams on their poll in rebuilding / uphill battle for bowl eligibility is UCF, Arizona, Oklahoma State, and West Virginia. Now, AI is essentially pulling from a lot of these services out there, whether it be the Phil Still, On3, 247 Sports, The Athletic. It's pulling from a lot of resources to kind of compile this. And so that's it's more of a list at kind of what is kind of, I wouldn't call it a consensus, but kind of what a lot of places are kind of looking at these teams. So with that said, that was just more for fun. Looking at my poll, as I said, I don't fully feel comfortable with the exact spot of all these teams. I would feel confident in maybe the tiers that I've built and kind of sliding teams around in each of those, but I don't know that everything is going to be perfect. It's easy to pick a team right now and say, hey, I think this team's going to do well, and then you could look back on it and have egg on your face. As I said, this is a snapshot in time. It's a preseason expectations, kind of what I expect. But it's also not a true indication of how I think it'll finish, even though that's kind of what the conversation about this is supposed to be. But I think that's kind of how I'm viewing it. So my tier 1 teams, these are the ones that I think are the teams that have the best chance to win a championship, right? That's not to say there's a guarantee, but I think there's less questions around these teams. They feel more of a guarantee in the sense of just what they have returning or kind of the lack of questions surrounding them, that kind of stuff. And so for me, my number 1 team this year is actually going to be Baylor. I think Baylor has a ton coming back. I do think that they're legit. I also don't believe that I don't believe that there's always a momentum from the previous season. I think that can help, but I don't know that that is always a guarantee for the next year. With that said, I do think this Baylor team can be pretty remarkable, and so we'll see what happens there. Next up, I have Arizona State. I do think Arizona State, regardless of how you feel about them, I think they've improved. They're obviously the reigning champs, and they're going to get a lot of luck that way. But then, I think this is a team that is really solid. And Sam Levitt is going to be a dynamic player again. But can they do it without Cam Scadaboo? That's my biggest question. It's a big question. But I still think they have a larger margin of error, we'll say, and being able to do what they want to do. And then Iowa State. So Arizona State and Iowa State, both teams that faced each other in the Big 12 championship. I think they return a fair amount. They have not a lot of questions. There is some turnover, right? They're not as veteran laden as Baylor and Arizona State, but I do think that they have the experience and the positions available to them that allows them to be successful. So those are my top three. I can make a case for a lot of other teams, and I depending on how many times I do this, I would, but I think those are the ones with the least questions, and that's kind of how I've tiered them. Tier 2, these are the teams that I think have questions but have a ton of potential to win a conference. Right now, I have Texas Tech at number 4. Based on the talent that they have, there's a lot of reasons why this team should be good. They also have a manageable schedule, so I think there's opportunities for them to be able to roll through the schedule and just pick up wins, right? And that matters a ton. With that said, this could all blow up in their face, and this is the team where on paper, you look at them and then you say, Texas Tech should be dynamic, they should be good, they should be the best in the conference. But it doesn't always go that way. We found that out with Colorado to an extent, where they brought in a ton of talent from the transfer portal, and it didn't always work. I still think Texas Tech is at another level, which is why I'm believing them a little bit more. But with that said, I think it all has to come together, and it has to be it just has to work, right? And I don't know that they've fully done that, but if anybody can, Texas Tech has funded themselves in a way that they can do it. So number 4 is Texas Tech. Number 5, I've got Utah. Same thing. There's a lot of questions around this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. If it comes together, though, I absolutely think that they can be a team that's in the conversation. Now, with that said, it's easy. I know a lot of fans want to say, okay, that they're going to go win the conference. And I'm not saying that they can't. But it's hard to go from 5-7 and make a complete jump to, let's say, 10-2 or whatever that may be. Not impossible in this era as much as it was in past eras, right? Transfer portal can completely change things. So I think based on how Utah played last year, in arguably the worst year of Kyle Whittingham's offensive tenure, that says something. I think they have potential with who they've brought in, not just with Devin Dampier, but who they've brought in on the offensive side of the ball. This team can be dynamic. You also lost a lot of one-possession games last year that can flip. Do you get the luck this year? Assuming that injuries don't play a factor in large part this year, this is a Utah team that absolutely I like. And that's not just because I cover the team. I do think that there's a lot of upward momentum. Phil still has them as his number, tied with number 1 with Baylor and Iowa State. So there's a lot of belief from a lot of people that this Utah team could be good. The thing that's holding them back is the questions just around how it's all going to come together. Similarly to Texas Tech, when you bring in that many new players, do they jive? Early prognostications say yes, but is that always going to be the case? And then number 6 in my final part of this tier is Kansas State. Kansas State intrigues me. They're 100% could be in that tier 1 where, there's not as many questions, but I don't know that Avery Johnson has much more that he can give. And so to me, there's potential there, and I think he could take a next step, but I think Kansas State may top out with kind of what they've got. With that said, they lost a few games late in the end of the season. Does the conversation around them change based on kind of who they're bringing back and kind of how they finish if they did a little bit better? Probably. But I think Kansas State is still ones with some questions. There's not a lot of answers there. They lose some dynamic players, but they also have some returning. That's why I keep them in this spot. And, you could make a case for them being 3. You could make a case for them being 2. Whatever you want to put them in, I could make that argument. But for now, I'm putting them at number 6 because I think that's kind of where it's at. My tier 3, I have 5 teams in this tier, and quite honestly, I don't know where to put a lot of them because there's so many questions about them, and I still think that they can be good, but, sorting them into this is kind of tough. And so the way that I've sorted it, I'm going to go pretty high on Cincinnati. I think they've brought in a lot of talent, so they're number 7. I think they've brought in a lot of talent. Brendan Sorsby, not the best quarterback in terms of talent in the Big 12 compared to his peers, but I think a solid player. There's going to be questions about this team though. They've got to come together. Their defense has to improve. Obviously, they've been known as a defensive school in years past, but that was in a different conference. at the G5 level. Have they made in year 3 of their transition to a power conference? Are they there yet? I think they've made some changes based on transfer portals that can help them, but there's still a lot of questions there. So I'm high on them. I'm going to put them there, even though there's probably some other teams that could be higher than them, but that's where it's going to be. Number 8 is TCU. Josh Hoover, a phenomenal quarterback that can do a ton with his arm, but it's the pieces around him. Can they do what they need to be able to make sure that they can stay relevant, right? You go from a few years removed of being in the national championship game to just kind of existing. And they're good in the Big 12, but they haven't been back to that level where you can count on them. And so maybe Josh Hoover is that guy where he can get them there. I still think they need an improved defense to make sure that they're there. But this is a team that is really just by definition a mid team until they prove otherwise. So really curious there. Number 9, BYU. Look, I've gone back and forth on this, and anybody that's a BYU fan that's listening to it, if they are, you're going to hate this pick. You're going to think that they're absolutely in the tier 1 or tier 2. And there may be a scenario where I don't disagree with you. I just think when you have to replace your quarterback, it's tough, right? And you're doing that late in the season, not late in the season, but late in the offseason. I understand there's been a lot of hype around Bear Bachmeier. I understand that he's got a lot of talent. He's a guy that there should be a lot of hope and optimism. BYU also has a fairly favorable schedule, and so it's not tough, right? Number 9 may be absolutely too low, and I'll agree with you there. To me, I'm putting them there in the middle simply because we don't know the questions there. There are also some turnovers on the defensive side of the ball. With that said, I do trust Jay Hill that he's going to have that defense great. And so if there is a situation there that you can buy stock in, it's going to be that defense. Now, the offense, though, how do you improve? Do you have a quarterback that can do more? I would contend that if Bear is the guy that you need him to be, I think he actually can unlock a level that Jake Retzlaff couldn't. But it's hard to be able to do that in your first year, especially as a freshman. So I'm using BYU at number 9 with some hesitation because I think that they can actually be better than that, but I just don't know, and so I'm putting them in the middle. Number 10, Kansas. Kansas is one of those that, they had a rough go at the beginning of the year, as we've talked about in previous episodes. Lose 5 of your first 6 games and then, reel off a bunch of other wins. But there's, as much as you bring back Jalen Daniels and everything, they're replacing a ton of players. And I just don't know anything right now to be able to say with matter of fact that they're going to be better. I don't know that there's some upward momentum there. Jalen Daniels has obviously been a great player for them, but to what level? Similarly to Avery Johnson, has he capped out at his level? And so it's more about the pieces around them and being able to do what they need to and being able to move forward there. Colorado, look, you have a 2 QB system right now where you're trying to figure it out. Is it Caden Salters? Is it Julian Lewis? Both incredibly talented athletes, but who is the guy, right? Caden Salter did really well at Liberty, but does he have the depth and the passing prowess that is going to get Colorado to that next level? Is their offensive line improved? Can their defense step up? Although their defense has been better, there's a lot of questions around that. And I don't know that there was a huge conversation around Colorado this offseason in terms of the transfer portal. That's not to say that they didn't get some guys, but I don't think it's been the same as it has in years past. I think some of that Coach Prime allure has kind of worn off a little bit, but I still think that this is a team that's sneaky good, right? And I think they could be okay. I just think there's so many more questions about this team than there are answers. And so that's, to me, the biggest question. We're going long, so we're going to quickly go through these last teams. So my tier 4, these are the teams that have, they can be the surprise, right? They can be an upstart team. They can be a team that can surprise people. But I think that there's a lot of questions around them that it's going to be tougher. Houston, number 12. I just don't know, right? Like they showed progress last year. There was optimism around them, but there's just a lot to be able to improve to that next level of where they need to be able to compete. They could be a team that is on the rise and does well. I just don't foresee it. And so for that matter, I have them at 12. Arizona at 13. It's just not working right now. And obviously you have Noah Fafita, who in the Pac-12 era was dynamic and great, and he had, Tedero McMillan, who he could throw to. Now that he doesn't have that security blanket, what happens, right? And I just don't know that Arizona has done a ton in the transfer portal or in any facet of the game to really give you confidence that they're going to suddenly compete for a title. Things could change, but as of right now, I think there's so many more questions around this team than answers. UCF, yes, you get Scott Frost back, but you're essentially retooling both sides of the ball. Is this team ready for that? I don't know. There's so many more questions there, and I don't see a big surge yet. And so that's kind of where I have them. Last tier, these are the teams where it's just like, what the heck is going on? And for different reasons. I have Oklahoma State at 15. They're mostly because there's no real answers there. They don't have a bona fide quarterback where you feel super confident in. Offensive line play was terrible last year. Got beat up on the defense. It was a disaster. And quite honestly, I could put this team at 16 because I just don't see that they've got all the answers for them. Now, Mike Gundy, he could absolutely get this team into the middle of the conference, but I just don't know that there's a lot of answers there. And lastly, West Virginia, you have Rich Rod. This could blow up, or this could be a great opportunity. They're bringing in an incredible amount of transfers. They retooled both sides of the ball. There's not a lot of holdover from the last staff. This is a complete reworked offense, reworked defense. Rich Rod likes to be aggressive. He likes to move fast, which can bode well at times. But if it's a disaster and things don't go well, it's not going to go well. So they're simply last because there's just the most questions around them, right? There's just not a lot of optimism around this team in terms of what they could beat. Now, with that said, I could see them in the middle of the conference, that Rich Rod wins some games that he's not expected to. This is a team that can be much better. If there is a sleeper, maybe it is West Virginia. I don't think they're conference title contender good, West Virginia, but I think this is a team that is going to have a lot of questions around them that are far bigger questions, right? And it's just because you have a completely new staff. With that said, there are pieces on this roster that I think are, can give you some optimism and can be exciting. That's why maybe you put Oklahoma State below them, but it's still, compared to the rest of their peers in the Big 12, I just don't think that they have it. So that's my poll. You can like it, you can hate it. I hate it, I like it. It's all the same. It's more of just a snapshot, like I said, and that's kind of what we're going to go with. So I appreciate you for listening today. I'm going to head out to Big 12 Media Days, and we'll get the recaps here. But I appreciate you listening. If you have any questions, hit me up, and we'll catch you later.